Hi, everyone. Welcome to the GoldFish Report. I'm your host, Louisa. Today is Wednesday, September 11th, 2019, and this is our GoldFish Report number 387. And we're doing this today because we do a commemorative memorial, essentially, report every year for 9/11. And to present this with me is, of course, my good friend, the Vets. How are you, Jim? Thanks for being with me.
Fine, Louisa. It's very amusing to hear that Bolton was upset about Trump having a meeting with the Taliban as though they had anything to do with 9/11. Frankly, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Palestinians, none of them had anything to do with 9/11. It was an Israeli operation, the Mossad operating in conjunction with Dick Cheney and the neocons in the Department of Defense, most of whom had come from the Project for a New American Century and were dual U.S.-Israeli citizens.
Well, Jim, I know that you have published a book on this and you have many collaborators, and you also submitted information to the president, testimony, expert testimony to the president that was collaborated by Robert David Steele, by many experts, including John Lear, regarding the impossibility of planes being used and so forth. And we're going to go through all of this, folks. We're going to go through the fact that this official story it falls apart in every single regard. We're going to go through this in detail, and we're going to start with Jim.
Okay, Louisa. Well, we got the official story about these flights out of Boston Logan, Flight 11, which is alleged to have hit the North Tower. We have the flight 175 out of Boston Logan alleged to have hit the south. We have a flight out of Newark 93 that's supposed to have crashed in Shanksville. And then we have a flight out of Dulles that's supposed to have hit the Pentagon, Flight 77. Now, some of your listeners may be absolutely dumbfounded to hear that all of this was fabricated, that none of these planes actually crashed. Indeed, astonishingly enough, it was Gerard Holmgren, who is a blues musician from Australia, who recognized that Flight 11, North Tower, wasn't even in the air that day. It wasn't scheduled. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics keeps records of every departure and every landing of every commercial flight in the United States. And what he discovered was that there was no American Airlines flight scheduled for Boston Logan on 9/11. That means it wasn't even in the air. He also discovered that there was no American Airlines Flight 77 scheduled to depart from Washington Dulles on 9/11, which means that it too was not even in the air. In other words, what I'm explaining, what I'm going to go through, is to show you how they faked it, how they faked Flight 11 hitting the North Tower, how they faked Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon. And believe it or not, and this may be even more startling, we know that, in fact, United 93 did not crash in Shanksville, that United 175 did not hit the South Tower. I'm going to explain in detail how we know this to be the case, but where Federal Administration, Aviation Administration records show that the planes used for those two flights, and bear in mind, you could use the same plane for different flights, one day from Tampa to Chicago, the next from New York to San Francisco, were not formally deregistered and taken out of service until September 28, 2005. Both were deregistered, formally taken out of service on September 28, 2005, raising the questions then, how can planes that weren't even in the air, 11 and 77, have crashed on 9/11? And how can planes that crashed on 9/11, 93 and 175, have still been in the air 4 years later? I'm going to go through and give you that how we know this to be the case. Mind you, there is no doubt about it for those who have done serious research on this subject. And what I'm describing to you is also sometimes referred to as no planes theory. It doesn't mean we don't have any video of planes. It doesn't mean we don't have any debris of planes. What we have is fakery, that none of the commercial carriers that were alleged to have crashed on 9/11 actually crashed on 9/11. So that the no planes theory consists of the conjunction of four theses: that Flight 11 did not hit the North Tower, Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon, that Flight 93 did not crash in Shanksville, and that Flight 175 did not hit the South Tower. I'm going to proceed to prove these four theses to be the case, which means that paradoxically enough, even though we're supposed to have gone to war because 19 Islamic terrorists commandeered four commercial carriers and brought about these crashes, none of that actually took place. It was all an illusion. Now, here we are in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and notice the size of the hole. It's actually only about 10 feet wide, 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide. Now, the aircraft here, which was a Boeing 757, had a wingspan of 175 feet. It had a tail that stood 44 feet above the ground. It weighed in excess of 100 tons. So it's implausible that any plane actually crashed there. And indeed, I'm going to explain how we know no plane did crash there. Look at the amount of debris you have from real plane crashes, whether they're in Missouri or Amsterdam or Russia. Shanksville being the outlier, Shanksville being completely, totally different. In fact, the two reporters first on the scene both had the same report, namely that the eerie aspect of the crash site was that there was no sign that any plane had crashed there. And of course, there was no sign any plane had crashed there because no plane had crashed there. The government has sought to explain away the absence of debris by insisting this was an area where mining took place, and that this plane, which was upside down because the passengers tried to retake it, and in the commotion it turned over as it came down to land in Crashville, in Shanksville, had disappeared into an abandoned mine shaft. Look at that. Disappeared into abandoned mine shaft, so we don't have any debris. I can't begin to tell you the absurdity of this story. Which is further compounded by the fact that we know what to do with miners who are trapped in mine shafts. We break out the bright lights and the heavy equipment and we dig 24/7 to recover them in the hope that by some miracle, one or more of them might have survived. But we did not do that in the case of Flight 93, in spite of the fact that there were 45 souls aboard, which, like the other flights, was very odd because it had a capacity of 289. With such a minimal capacity, there's no way it would be commercially viable to fly these planes across country. Now, on the far left, you see a photograph that was allegedly taken by a woman named McClatchy from her home, but it turns out that the plume there is not the type of plume you'd expect from a plane crash. It looks much more like the plume from a detonation explosion in the middle than the plume from a plane crash, which you see on the right, which typically produces massive volumes of dark black smoke. I mean, here's a plane crash. Right. This one, I believe, was in fact in Russia, Louisa. Yeah. Notice how totally different. In other words, it turns out that photograph was actually photoshopped. And if you followed the plume of smoke, it turns out to be coming up from a pond, a lake that was in the vicinity. Now, this is rather fascinating. Pilots for 9/11 Truth were able to track, using the air-ground communications, that Flight 93 was still airborne after its alleged crash. In fact, it turns out that Flight 93 was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, after it had allegedly crashed. And as I previously explained, it wasn't even formally taken out of service until 28 September 2005, 4 years later. Now, pilots are very sophisticated. This is a group of former or current military and commercial pilots, and they have done some of the most brilliant work on 9/11. Louisa, would you like to comment on Shanksville before I turn to the Pentagon?
Yeah, if I could screen share just for a moment, Jim, because just like the photo that you just showed, there's a remarkable difference. It's amazing that every other plane crash you see, there's fuselage, there's some debris of some kind. There's one piece of debris somewhere. One, at least one. Look at this. I mean, look at all these photos of plane crashes here, and you know, different kinds of plane crashes. Sure, they're all going at different speeds. You know, different situations. There is debris everywhere. There is something there, some piece of debris, and miraculously, I mean, it was an absolute miracle that in Shanksville, it swallowed the whole plane like
I
a
know.
like
Lock, stock, and barrel.
like a pill, like a blue pill. It swallowed it, and that is, you know, pun intended. I mean, honestly, people, do you really think for a minute that a plane this size is not going to leave one piece of debris or human?
You're right, Louise. It's embarrassingly bad.
Okay, go ahead.
Colonel George Nelson, who was a U.S. Air Force crash investigator, told me that it looked to him as though someone had dug a trench, filled it with trash, and blown it up. And that's what had happened in Shanksville, that no plane had crashed there. And I know of no one who's a serious student of this matter who has drawn a different conclusion.
Right.
Now, at the Pentagon, although they have staggering numbers of cameras here, the Pentagon only released 5 frames. And you notice the first at the upper left is conveniently labeled plane, and the others all show the growing fireball. Now, one of the peculiarities is that the date timestamp is wrong for 9/11. It doesn't record this event as having occurred on the right date at the right time, and therefore there's immediately suspicion this whole thing is fake. Now, if you look here, there is something that might be a plane just above this gate mechanism here at the top, in the top left image to the right. So I asked Jack White, who is a legendary student of photos and films from JFK Research, a dear friend and collaborator now departed this earth, whether he could size the image of a Boeing 757 to the scale of the tail. And he did so, and you'll notice the 757 is about twice as large as what you see there. Now, I have spoken to pilots about this white plume and aeronautical engineers, and they both assured me that that could not be the exhaust from a jet engine, which would be black, but could be the exhaust from a missile that was being fired into the building. And indeed, further research we have done, especially by Dennis Camino, who's proven quite brilliant at 9/11 research. This appears to have been an unmanned aerial vehicle, a Global Hawk, that actually did fire a missile into the building, so that we're actually capturing the silhouette of the Global Hawk, not a Boeing 757. Now here is the hit point, Louisa.
Right.
Remember now the enormity of the airplane. You see here a chain link fence, a couple automobiles, or 2 enormous spools of cable you can't quite see here. There are unbroken windows surrounding the hit point, which is about 10 feet high and 16 or 17 feet wide. What you don't have is a massive pile of debris from a 100-ton airliner. You don't have bodies, seats, luggage, wings, tail. Not even the engines were recovered from the Pentagon. Now, it was about 45 minutes later that we had the collapse of the roof. That didn't occur concurrent with the purported crash. And of course, for good reason, because there was no crash. Now, when they excavated the part of the building that collapsed, you notice it's remarkable that there were no signs of an intense fire having occurred there. Notice here on the 4th floor, there is a wooden stand for what appears to be an Oxford Unabridged Dictionary. It seems to have survived. No signs of fire here. which suggests that those massive fireballs we saw in those original frames were in fact fabrications themselves. Now, according to the government's official account, a Boeing 757, and this is to scale, barely skimming the ground, traveling over 400 miles an hour, hit the building. Now, what's fascinating about that is that those massive engines hanging down would have plowed enormous furrows into the ground. The Pentagon lawn would have been a mess from all the debris from the plane crash scattered around. And yet, you can see here, when these two civilian lime green fire trucks that just happened to be in the vicinity responded, there's no debris at all. There's no debris at all. Where are the bodies? Where are the seats? Where is the luggage? Where are the wings? Where's the tail? This is a 100-ton airliner. There ought to have been aluminum debris everywhere. Instead, you see the virtually clear, pristine Pentagon lawn. Here's another photograph shown by the BBC. This was taken slightly later. But notice the lawn is perfectly clear. It's undamaged. It's unfurrowed. There's no sign of any plane having crashed there. Here is yet another, and this is now after that segment of the wall had collapsed. No sign of any plane having actually crashed there. Now, when the debris did finally start showing up...
When the debris finally started showing up.
Yeah, it appeared to me, by the way, that it had been dropped by a C-130, a cargo aircraft that was circling the area, because it would have been so hazardous to have officers and men bringing debris out onto the lawn. This was by far the most interesting piece of fuselage. It does come from a 757. But notice it looks like it's been peeled off of the fuselage. It doesn't look as though it's involved in a violent collision. It would have been all crumpled up.
Why isn't it black?
And it doesn't show any signs of having been in an intense fire. Not only that, but notice this is a piece of green vine, not indigenous to the Arlington, Virginia area, which is a clue as to the origin of this piece of debris. There you see a close-up. Now, an attorney by the name of Jim Hansen, now retired from Columbus, Ohio, tracked down this debris to a crash that had occurred near Cali, Colombia, in 1995, where a Boeing 757, the pilots lost their way, and they crashed through a jungle where these vines are in abundance into the side of a mountain. Now, interestingly, just as though I didn't point it out at the time, all of the airport security was provided by an Israeli firm, ICTS, for the airports at Logan, at Newark, and at Dulles. It was an Israeli firm that secured the debris, that salvaged this crash site, only to save up that piece in order to plant it on the Pentagon lawn on 9/11. Now, this is the pilot who was circling that 130, who claimed when the BBC asked him, and they'd interviewed me about this, they've actually come to my home twice. The first time they interviewed me for 8 hours about 9/11, Louisa. Then they came back and interviewed me for another 4 for the second, another installment of their conspiracy file series about 9/11. The captain said that my theory that he had dropped the debris was absurd. Notice he didn't say it was false. He said it was absurd.
Right.
Now, here's the official trajectory of that plane flying at over 400 miles an hour and approaching the building, just skimming the ground. It is alleged to have taken out a series of lamp posts. Now, let me make the following point about elementary physics. We're dealing here with something known as a relativity of motion. In other words, you can assume the lampposts were stationary and the plane was moving, but the effect of a plane traveling at over 400 miles an hour hitting stationary lampposts would be the same as if the plane had been stationary and had been hit by those lampposts traveling over 400 miles an hour. It would have opened the wings, the fuel stored in the wings would have mixed with oxygen, would have burst into flame. It would have caused it to cartwheel all across the lawn, and yet we see no signs of that having happened for the very good reason that it had not happened. Not only that, but we had a lot of witnesses who were at a Citgo station here who saw a plane approach, north of the Citgo station when the official trajectory is the green, approaching south, because it turned out that they did have a plane fly toward the building and then swerve over it. It's very interesting. When I was brought on to Hannity and Combs for the first time to ask about 9/11, since I'd founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth, I was asked by Alan Combs whether I had any evidence that any member of the administration, such as Dick Cheney, had been involved in 9/11. And I said, absolutely. How Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, had reported that he was in an underground bunker beneath the White House with Dick Cheney during 9/11, where, by the way, Dick Cheney appears to have been the executive director, that an aide to Cheney came up and told him, sir, it's 50 miles out, then reported, sir, it's 40 miles out, then reported, sir, it's 30 miles out. Do the order still stand? At which point Cheney got up quite angry, whipped around his head and said, of course, have you heard anything different? Well, a plane was approaching the Pentagon, and the obvious thing to have done, given that planes had been used to hit, reportedly to hit the North and the South Tower in New York, would have been to shoot down the plane. Then you take out the plane and the passengers, but you don't lose property or personnel at the target. This plane was used to approach the Pentagon. On the trajectory, you see the many witnesses, the gold lines. Many of them thought, because of an explosion that occurred at the Pentagon, approximately coinciding with the plane approaching there, that it had hit the Pentagon. But that's false. It actually swerved over the building. It turns out that another friend of mine from JFK Research by the name of Roy Schaefer had a buddy by the name of Dave Ball, who was a trucker, who just happened to be right in front of the Pentagon. And he told Roy how he'd watched as a plane flew toward the Pentagon and then swerved over it. That was this plane that Norman Mineta, not fully understanding what the aide was saying to Dick Cheney, overheard. It was a part of an elaborately staged scenario to make people think that a real plane had really hit the Pentagon. Roy was very troubled and puzzled how Dave believed that a plane had hit the Pentagon, even though the plane he had seen had swerved over it. I told Roy to tell Dave to come on my show and talk about it, that he'd be much safer once he got his story out. Roy attempted to reach him, but 2 weeks later, he was found dead in an abandoned building. This is a problem you have when you have information the government doesn't want to get out, but you haven't talked about it yet or made it public. You can't quite read it in the circle there, but it says punch out. This is in the C ring. The Pentagon has 5 rings from the outside, the E, D, C, B, and A ring. And this is alleged to have been a hole that was caused by a landing gear from the plane that hit the building. Except, as I observe, it says punch out. Notice how symmetrical is this hole. Numerous Pentagon personnel reported smelling cordite, which is a common military explosive. They appear to have punched out this hole. Had it been hit, in fact, by a landing gear, it would have hit at an angle. It would have been completely asymmetrical and looked very, very different. So this was part of the special effects that were to accompany what allegedly took place. Now, this is completely fascinating. It turns out that Jamie McIntyre, who was by far the best reporter CNN had at the time, was asked by the anchor from his on-location reporting about the plane having hit the Pentagon, and he said to her, this is verbatim, well, you might think so, but from my close-up inspection, there's no sign of any large plane having hit anywhere near the Pentagon, no wings, no fuselage, nothing like that. They're only small pieces you could pick up with your hand. Now, Jamie was an honest guy. He was put under tremendous pressure to retract, which he did in the following way. He said only a fool would have reported that a plane didn't hit the Pentagon, meaning he had been a fool to report the truth in the expectation that was what the network expected of him, and that was his obligation as a journalist. He found the heavy water of lies too difficult to bear and shortly thereafter retired.
Oops, what happened there? We froze. Jim will be back shortly. See if I can connect. All right, I'm in. Stop.
In April, Gallup, who was a civilian employee who worked at the Pentagon, had come in that morning with her infant son. And when she turned on her computer, there was a massive explosion that took place. She walked out through the hole right there and saw no signs of any aircraft. She didn't smell residue of explosives. In Germany, the Major General Albert Stubblebine, who'd been in charge of all U.S. military signals intelligence, including photographic, was interviewed by a reporter about 9/11, and particularly about the Pentagon. And Stubblebine explained how he knew that no aircraft had hit the Pentagon because the imprint of the wings would have been made on the soft limestone facade of the building, and it wasn't there. Right. Meanwhile, later in the afternoon, there was a report that the Capitol building was being targeted, and members of the House and Senate rushed out onto the steps of the building, looked across the Potomac, and saw billowing black smoke, which puzzled me enormously, since I knew that those lime green fire trucks had put out the very modest fires at the Pentagon. So I looked into it and found that the smoke was coming from a series of enormous dumpsters in front of the Pentagon. They were not even from the building. In fact, in mid-2006, a member of Scholars came by and we visited in Duluth, and he showed me 44 more frames where you, from a National Geographic special, where you could actually see light in between the dumpsters and the building itself. In other words, it was a Hollywood special effect. Let me just add, Louisa, that like a Flight 93, Flight 77 was only officially had 64 out of 289 seats filled. Again, ridiculous to think that a commercial carrier could make money flying planes that are only a quarter or even less full. I mean, it's embarrassingly bad. Is there anything you'd like to add about the Pentagon before I turn to New York?
Yeah, if you could let me screen share an image. I hope, folks, we did have some computer interruption here, so I'm hoping that my images that I have are still available here to view, as if, you know, and just as Jim had shown as well, pretty much the same image. Where's my screen share? It's a miracle that there's no fuselage here as well. That's around that an airplane could not fit in there. Of course, it could have swallowed it like another blue pill. Don't you
see,
think?
this was a C-ring, Louisa. This was supposed to have been made by a landing gear after passing through the E-ring and the D-ring to hit the C-ring. But there's this. I had it circled in the earlier image, but it's called. Blow out or blast out, whatever. This appears to have been done with cordite. And in fact, there were multiple reports of the smell of military explosive. It was just a special effect.
Okay. Yeah. And so, also we saw video on YouTube of General Stubblebine giving his personal testimony regarding this. And I do want to just play that for just a moment so our viewers can hear him speaking about this.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Terrible loss of life. But this one thing he does is pull it.
This is Larry Silverstein talking about building.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So here's Larry Silver. Well, I know we're not at that point yet. Let me just see.
Oh, we won't be tonight because we discussed the buildings in Building 7 at our last show.
Right. Well, here's here.
Yeah. Get the volume up.
One of my officers, I had retired, one of my officers who had served under me, and she said, "Sir, the United States is at war."
Sorry, let me go a little bit faster here.
In the hole, however, was a turbine. Looked like the turbine from a missile. I can't prove that, I don't know, but there was something there that did not look like the engine from an airplane, but did look like a turban from a missile.
All right, well, there you see it in his own words. You know, he's a general, former general. He's passed away since.
Yeah. I mean, he was in charge of all U.S. military signals intelligence, including photographic. He was a top dog on military photographic intelligence, Louisa.
That's his
So
opinion.
for him to say,
Yeah.
he said it looked like it might have been the turbine of a missile. See, the Global Hawk fired a missile into the building, so he's actually confirming. That was research of Dennis Camino that nailed that down.
Very good, Jim.
Now we turn to New York. And here we have...
Wait, I'm sorry, Jim. I'm sorry to interrupt, but wasn't this section of the Pentagon, didn't this house a certain, wait a minute, this...
Yeah, I can pick it up, Louisa.
Are you going to talk about that? What was contained?
I'll speak about it right now.
Okay, why that section was targeted.
This West Wing had just been renovated. It was the only section that had been reinforced, so as there wouldn't be damage that would affect other parts of the Pentagon. Not only that, but it was bereft of personnel and equipment, except that Donald Rumsfeld had instructed the section chief of the budget to track, get all of his personnel and records relating to a missing $2.3 trillion he'd reported the day before to be missing from the Pentagon budget. Now, what's significant about that, Louisa, is any experienced Washington politicians know you don't give a big story like that early in the day because it's going to, as they say, grow legs. It's going to be picked up by reporters. It's as though he knew something would intervene and he'd be able to waltz into the halls of Congress and ask for hundreds of billions more in defense spending the following day, which is exactly what happened. So I was startled when I read the list of 120 purported casualties from the Pentagon and found there were like 3 dozen who are accountants or financial experts who'd been involved in this. The others who were killed, by the way, were principally from the Office of Naval Intelligence, which we believe was actually trying to track what was going on 9/11, that they had their suspicions, so they were targeted too.
Thank you, Jim. That was significant. It's significant to note that there was a reason why it hit this side and to destroy evidence of that missing money. Of course, we all remember the day before, we all remember Donald Rumsfeld announcing publicly that there was, what, $4 trillion missing from
2.3, Louisa.
2.3. Well,
Yeah.
I've had so many numbers. It's up to 21 now, according to Catherine Austin Fitts, but whatever. It's $2.3 trillion missing from the budget, unaccounted for. And of course, everybody forgot about that. Now, how do you ask for more money after you just go one day, you say there's 2.3 trillion unaccounted for, but we need more money?
Pretty convenient if there happens to be a terrorist attack.
Pretty convenient, Jim. I think so. I think so.
Especially one that takes out the evidence of the missing money. Now, it just so happens there was a French film team known as the Naudet brothers who just happened to be doing a special about New York firefighters, and they were filming about a purported gas leak when, stunningly enough, they heard the sound of a plane. And frankly, by the time you hear the sound of the plane is far, far gone from the origin of the sound. So he would have been looking up to his right. Instead, the cameraman swung his camera up to the left and captured the hit on the North Tower. Now, let me give you a clue about what's going on here. This was filmed on Duane Street. And it turns out Naudet Brothers just happens to be an anagram of Duane Street. It's that bad. They're that blatant, Louisa.
Right.
Now here's what and in New York, it was 767s, and in Shanksville and Pentagon, 757s. Here's what a 767 would have looked like approaching the North Tower, which is identifiable by the antenna. But here's what we actually have in the film footage. Rosalie Grable, also known as the Webb Fairy, described this as a sequence of flying pigs. In other words, she did a time sequence to develop this image, and she's completely right. Now, interestingly, here's the first hit of flash flame, something going on there. But what is also striking is that initially you have what looks like a Z in terms of impact. But by the time the clouds and debris clear, it's turned into a V. And not only that, but here at the right tip, they actually extend the V. So here you have a Naudet frame of impact initially, but later they've exaggerated it. And these gashes, Louisa, were really cartoonish. I mean, the wings of a plane are really very fragile. Yeah. And the idea that it would have been able to cut through steel, I mean, this was very massive steel. These external steel support columns is faintly ridiculous. It appears that behind the enormous fireball, which cleared up after 15 or 20 seconds, you had these little points of light that were going off, which appear to have been explosives that were being used.
Right.
Explosives that were being used, that were being set off to cut out the image.
The Wile E. Coyote, image.
Yeah, the Wile E. Coyote, exactly. Behind it, which I attribute, by the way, to an Israeli group. They were known as let's see, they were inside the building. I'll talk more about them. Here's an indication of the cutout in the North Tower. It was intersecting 7 different floors. Now, each of those floors consisted of a steel truss connected at one end to the massive core columns, at the other to the external steel support columns, filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. The variance is because the trusses had V's in them that were 4 inches deep. So in some places, the concrete would be 4 and other 8 inches deep. Now, because the buildings were 208 feet on a side, what you're talking about is intersecting with 7 acres of concrete on steel trusses. Now, we all know, Louisa, the impact that a small bird weighing only a few ounces can make on the fuselage of an airplane, where the nose is the most fragile part.
Can I just show that? Because I have pictures of that, just so viewers can see that comparison.
Sure, I'd be delighted for you to show that. Yeah.
Let's just, while you're talking about it, let's just screen share this insanity for a second. This is what a bird does. A bird, Jim, not a metal bird, a bird made of flesh and bones. This is the damage that it does to the tip of the aircraft.
I love it.
Look at this. Look at how it damages. Now, how does a plane stand up to cut through steel when a bird does this? It's just, they're laughing at us, Jim. They laugh right in our faces to think we're dumb enough to believe this.
You're 100% correct, Louisa.
Go ahead. Can you go back?
100% correct.
Sorry, but I had that cued, so while you were talking about it, it's important to have that. It's important for people to have that visual in their mind, so they, at the time we're talking about it, so they realize it.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Yeah. There were these Israeli art students inside the buildings who were doing their thing, including external performance art. They actually got out external to the buildings. And I believe they prepped the buildings for the cutouts. These were all fuse boxes, by the way. It's very odd. They had box after box of these fusees. They were called the gelatin group. And what's interesting is gelatin is also a name for a kind of explosive. So I believe that the gelatin group was there to rig the buildings in order to create those cutouts.
Because they have to tell you what they're going to do to you. See, it's a satanic thing where they deceive everything that they do. They have to hide it. They're masters in deception. But in their strange, so they do it through. It's like cryptic. They have to do it through deception. So they have to tell you in Luciferian and satanic people who are Satanists and worship Satan, this is what they have to do. They have to tell you what they're going to do before they do it. That's the law. So Satan can do whatever he wants here as long as he tells you what he's going to do. But he doesn't have to tell you directly. He tells you indirectly.
Look how blatant by calling this a gelatin group.
This is it. They know, and they kind of laugh at us, call us goyim, right?
Yeah.
Because it's right in our face.
That's right.
Right in our face.
That's right. And Naudet Brothers being an anagram of Duane Street. Embarrassing. It turns out there were a whole lot of activities going on 9/11. I mean, this is a general panorama of New York, but there were a host of these groups, these art students from Israel. There may have been as many as 200. They had a variety of tasks on 9/11, including planting jammers on buildings, on Exhibit 1 to block Port Authority dispatchers and first responder radios. plant explosives on the New Jersey side of the George Washington Bridge where the cables are anchored in order to collapse the bridge, explode a truck inside the Lincoln Tunnel, explode a truck inside the Holland Tunnel, park trucks with demolition devices in specific parking areas of the Twin Towers, coordinate with Muhammad Atta and his group where they were just the patsies. They really didn't have a significant role to play here. And in fact, as I'll observe, 15 of the 19 alleged terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. None of them were from Iraq. And Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with it, Louisa. There was a mural here on the side of a building. This was a moving systems building that was an asset of the Mossad, where they actually had on the side of the building the image of a plane, you know, in relation to the towers. Now, there were this group of 5 who were observed in Liberty State Park who were celebrating as they were filming the destruction of the Twin Towers. Well, they were reported by a suspicious neighbor, and they were arrested in a van, and the driver told the arresting officers, "We are not the problem. Our problem is your problem. The problem is the Palestinians," which is, of course, completely absurd. They found inside of the van residue of explosives. They found box cutters. They found passports. They found money. Well, these guys were arrested, and they were held for like 44 days until then assistant to Attorney General John Ashcroft directed their release. They went back to Israel, and 3 of them went on to an Israeli talk show and explained they had been there to document the destruction of the Twin Towers, which obviously presupposed knowledge. Here's Michael Chertoff, who'd also become our second Secretary of Homeland Security following Tom Ridge, who'd been the governor of Pennsylvania. Michael Chertoff, without any doubt, is Mossad. So what we're doing is putting these very devious, sinister people in key positions where they can sabotage the actions of the government of the United States to benefit Israel. Now, meanwhile, we had the event of the South Tower, and everyone's heard about the video footage of the plane, another 767 approaching the South Tower. By the way, before I leave Flight 11, it was allegedly filled with 92 passengers when it had a capacity of 351, 92. So maybe about a third or a little less than a third full. Again, it's anomalous that you have these transcontinental flights because they were all headed for California that are only partially full. Now here you see what is supposed to be a 767 approaching the South Tower. Now, pilots for 9/11 Truth have studied the videos and discovered that the flight at the speed at which this plane was flying at this relatively low level of 700 to 1,000 feet was approximately the cruising speed at 35,000 feet, where the air is only 1/3 as dense. At this lower altitude, in fact, the plane would have physically come apart in the air. And they actually have created a documentary called 9/11 Intercepted from pilots for 9/11 Truth, illustrating what would have happened had that been a real plane at the speed shown.
Right.
So it was, by the way, John Lear who gave an affidavit for a lawsuit in New York City, which you can find on my at 9/11 the 9/11 Scholars discussion blog. It's 911.ning.com or 911scholars.ning.com. You can read his affidavit where he, our most experienced pilot in the world, holding 15 international speed records and qualified in all areas of aircraft maintenance and performance, testified that because of the density of the air, the turbines couldn't suck the air through fast enough and would begin to function as brakes. They would have slowed down the plane.
Well, I have it right here, Jim. Let's just take a look at a few sentences if you want to let me screen share that while you're talking about it, because I do have that ready, of course, to talk about. So let me just pull that up and a second. Where did we do it? Here we go. So I'll screen share this. This is on John Lear's website, by the way. And so this is maybe excerpts of it. He says, John's 9/11 affidavit from January 2008, John Lear, a full age being duly sworn, deposed, and says, so this first few of them give his credentials, okay? So at this point in section 2, he starts to discuss the evidence. He says, no Boeing 767 airliners hit the Twin Towers as fraudulently alleged by the government, media, NIST, and its contractors. Such crashes did not occur because they are physically impossible, as depicted for the following reasons. In the case of UAL 175 going into the South Tower, as you're talking about, Jim, a real Boeing 767 would have begun telescoping, which when the nose hit the 14-inch steel columns, which are 39 inches on center, the vertical and horizontal tail would have instantaneously separated from the aircraft, hit the steel box columns, and fallen to the ground. And you can read all of this. He goes through, a very detailed,
Well, let me read a little more. The engines, when impacting the steel columns, would have maintained their general shape and either fallen to the ground or been recovered in the debris of the collapsing building. One alleged engine part was found on Murray Street at Church, but there should be 3 other engine cores weighing over 9,000 pounds each. Normal operating temperatures for these engines are 650 degrees Celsius, so they could not possibly have burned up. This is a photo of a similar sized engine from a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, which impacted the ocean at a high rate of speed. You can see the engine remains generally intact. Now I'm going to show that engine component found at Church and Murray, which was a plant. It was not a type that was still in use. It was unloaded and planning there. Moreover, he continues, when and if the nose of an airplane comes in contact with buildings 14 by 14 inch steel box columns and then 37 feet beyond the steel box columns of the building core, he's talking there about the core columns. The momentum of the wings would have slowed drastically, depriving them of the energy to penetrate the exterior and box columns. The spars of the wing, which extend outward, could not possibly have penetrated the 14-inch by 14-inch steel box columns placed 39 inches on center and would have crashed to the ground. But I'll show there's none of that debris on the ground. What he's showing here, too, by the way, is planted footage. This is planted parts that don't come from a Boeing 767.
And again, Jim, notice there's no, charred remnants, no indication that there's a fire on those pieces that are planted. But this is where he talks about the speed. Do you want to just add a couple more? Just to talk about the speed here? The argument that the energy...
okay. Here. The argument that the energy of the mass of the Boeing 767 at a speed of 540 miles an hour fails because no Boeing 767 could attain that speed at 1,000 feet above sea level because of parasite drag, which doubles with velocity, and parasite power, which cubes with velocity. The fan portion of the engine is not designed to accept the volume of dense air at that altitude and speed. So in fact, as he observes elsewhere, it would have begun to function as brakes.
Exactly.
In my opinion, based on extensive flight experience, both as captain and instructor in large 3- and 4-engine aircraft, is that it would have been impossible for an alleged hijacker with little or no time in the Boeing 767 to have taken over than flown a Boeing 767 at high speed, descending to below 1,000 feet above mean sea level and flown a course to impact the Twin Towers at high speed for 3 reasons. As soon as the alleged hijacker sat in the pilot's seat, they would be looking at an electronic flight instrumentation system display and comprised of 6 large multi-mode LCDs interspersed with clusters of hard instruments. These displays process the raw aircraft system and flight data into an integrated picture of the aircraft situation, position, and progress, not only in the horizontal and vertical dimensions, but also with regard to time and speed as well. Had they murdered the pilot with a box knife, as alleged, there would be blood all over the seat, the controls, the center pedestal, the instrument panel, and floor of the cockpit. A hijacker would have had to remove the dead pilot from the seat, which means he would have had electrically or manually place the seat in its rearmost position and then lifted the murdered pilot from his seat, further distributing blood, making the controls, including the throttles, wet, sticky, and difficult to hold. Even on a clear day, a novice pilot would be wholly incapable of taking control and turning a Boeing 767 toward New York because of his total lack of experience and situational awareness under these conditions. The alleged hijackers were not instrument rated, and controlled high altitude flight requires experience in constantly referring to and cross-checking altitude, attitude, and speed instruments. Using the distant horizon to fly visually under control is virtually impossible, particularly at the cruising speed of the Boeing 767 of 0.8 Mach. The alleged controlled descent into New York on a relatively straight course by a novice pilot is unlikely in the extreme because of the difficulty of controlling heading, descent rate, and descent speed with the parameters of controlled flight. There's more he adds too, Louisa, but this just shows how preposterous it was, you know, that those who were mapping this out had no idea of the complexity of the phenomena they were going to fake.
Yeah, I mean, they were saying that, you know, someone made a 90-degree, you know, one of them made a 90-degree turn. This one turned here and turned there at such high rates of speed. It's impossible. John Lear is saying it's impossible. So
yeah, I'm gonna elaborate on some of his observations. Now, as we've observed, the pilots and Lear observed the plane would have come apart physically in the air. Meanwhile, there were no collision effects. It just effortlessly disappears into the building. Notice here, it's half in, it's half out. You can see no damage to the building. It's perfectly astounding. In fact, with Flight 175, it was intersecting 8 different floors, each of which consisted of an acre of concrete on a steel truss. This flight, by the way, like the others, was only partially full. It had only 65 personnel aboard when it could have carried 351. Just again, another illustration of the absurdity of the whole scenario. Now, Jack White prepared this diagram, which is absolutely stunning because it shows how the jet liner melts through the steel wall. What we have here are frames from the Evan Fairbanks video was taken looking upward at the building. And what it shows is that the plane passes through its whole length in air in the same number of frames it passes through its whole length into a massive 500,000-ton steel building, the same number of frames. So it's the same distance in the same amount of time, meaning that velocity was constant, was not diminished, altered, or affected by hitting a 500,000-ton steel and concrete building, which is a manifest absurdity. You were talking, by the way, about the nose-out phenomenon, Louisa. In the bottom left here, you'll see it was actually captured, which shows something completely fake is going on here. And when the nose out occurred, suddenly the broadcasting of this historic footage went to black. They faded to black. They stopped broadcasting because there'd been a colossal glitch, a blunder. Yeah. Did you want to add something here?
Yes, I actually have that footage. If you will let me play that for just a second. I have everything to support what your presentation is, Jim.
It's wonderful. So, it's wonderful, Louisa.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, there's so much on this, and let me just get to the right this rare footage here. Okay, and I'm going to screen share. Let me get to clicking on this YouTube channel here. And where'd you go? Hold on a second. I have to find my screen share button. Sorry, folks. There's just a lot of controls at my fingertips here. So let me just go to collapse prior to critical collapse. There's people talking about, yeah. So let me just go through this real quick because it does show let's see if this was it here. That's the Pentagon. Hang on one second. Oh, the ball and all this other stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of video fakery and stuff going on here. Let me just see if this was the section here. Yeah. Let me see if this is it. The ball. Yeah, it's a ball. Some people said it wasn't a plane. Look, it's like a ball. Or over here, it's a ball. This is the faked one. To see where it blanks out. I do have that footage. Hang on one second. Oh, one of the other things that was very telling was all the people who were...
it's going to be right in there, I think.
Yeah, all the people who were
Yes, this is a Hezarkhani video taken from the side. That's the one that was
Right.
being analyzed before. Go ahead.
Right. All the people who were interviewed immediately afterwards were working for the
Yeah, people who called in were all related to the network. Some were
Yes.
husbands or wives or
Right.
employees, what have you.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's like a whole list of all the people who were there. Let me just see if I can find that. I might not be able to, but yeah, they were talking about I thought I had that.
I'm sure it's in there somewhere,
It
Louise.
is. Have you seen this footage before?
I know September Clues is very big about. There it was. There's
the nose coming out right there.
Yeah.
And then they show, right, that there's areas, I don't know if I can make that a little bit bigger here real quick, but here, let's back up and just show this a little bit more. Right. You see it coming at there, fade to black. See that?
Fade to black.
Yeah, that's what you're talking about right there, Jim. Let's just play that again so you can, this is what Jim's talking about. It cuts away as soon as, see, TV illusion, decide to dupe people. First they zoom in, then they zoom in again, but they don't get a plane. And notice it was a blue sky. It was a perfectly blue day that day. And look at it now.
Yeah.
You know, it's only fire on the top.
Yeah.
Fade to black. See how it cut away? Because they didn't
want you to see the nose, which is so fragile that birds can destroy it, but it can pass through a massive 500,000 ton building and come out perfectly intact. How absurd is that, Louise?
Not crash through a steel building. You see that? And so emerging the other side with its nose intact, just as you said. See, there it is. So they cut away. Exactly, Jim. And this is all CGI video fakery. And this is what all the networks were broadcasting, and they all had their script. There it is. The front was like no damage at all, Jim. Isn't that a miracle? Yep. How many miracles have there been, Jim? How many miracles have there been?
Quite a few on 9/11, Louisa.
So I just wanted to, back up what you were just saying.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
That was super.
I've got it all here to back you up. I told you
that was just super, Louisa.
Ready for you. Excellent.
Okay. So there are no collision effects, which is a violation of Newton's law. So what should have happened? This is Ace Baker. He did a video called the 9/11 Psy Opera. Quite brilliant. Here's a plane should have crumbled external to the building with body, seats, luggage, wings, tail falling to the building. Notice John Blair was making the same point. Here, after the spectacular fireball, we found the cutout there again. But look, beneath the buildings, both the North Tower and the South, no airplane debris on the street, no airplane debris on the sidewalk. Instead, we have a church in Murray, this engine component, which is antiquated. It's supposed to have come from one of the buildings, and people who are very naive and gullible bought it. Jack White discovered Fox News footage where you have 5 or 6 men wearing FBI vests unloading something heavy.
Yeah.
Notice they even seem to have left behind a dolly that they may have used to put it here. I just think that.
Yeah, right next to that passport, Jim.
It's sitting, yes. It's sitting on the sidewalk, which is undamaged. Had anything this massive hit a sidewalk at high velocity, it would have done enormous destruction. It's sitting underneath a steel canopy, a steel scaffolding with a canopy, but there's no damage to the scaffolding or the canopy. This is totally fake.
Yeah.
Totally fake.
Is that where they found the passport too? And so it had to be, the passport on the ground in New York City has to be the hijacker's passport, Jim.
This is not where they found the passport. Now, they were totally faking it. There were 3 different theories of how it was done. One was that it was CGI. Another that it was video compositing, where they added the image of the planes, but between the time when the footage was taken and the time it's broadcast, there's a 17-second delay where it could be added. And the third, that it was done using holography. There turns out to be a mode of holography that enables it to broadcast on air, that it doesn't require a solid object. Now, there were a lot of witnesses who reported having seen what they took to be a real plane in real time. But that would have been impossible if it had been done with CGI or with video compositing, because then the image of the plane in the air would only have been present in the broadcast footage. a fellow named Richard Hall did his Flight 175 radar study of the data. He studied the films and created a plot for the locations and times the plane would be approaching the building. And he found that the NIST claimed to have similar plots that was based on radar data, but it didn't look right to him. Well, he found there actually was a radar plot, only that the radar path was 1,200 feet to the side of the plots he'd made for the plane, leading him to infer that it was actually a plane traveling to the side on this trajectory that was projecting the image here seen by the yellow cubes into the building that can account for the impossible speed, the lack of collision, the impossible physics. And the military radar didn't detect a plane in the observed position because it was just a hologram. But it did pick up the flight of the real plane, which was projecting it. So it was on this order as to what was actually taking place, where they had to fly faster than was possible for a Boeing 767 in order to preserve the integrity of the holographic image, and where I even received a page from an Australian military manual for an airborne holographic projector. The holographic projector displays a three-dimensional visual image in a desired location removed from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic perception management. Also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. Here's the real plane you see projecting an image, which appears to be what happened on 9/11. By the way, Richard D. Hall applied the same technique to the North Tower, and he derived the same analysis, Louisa.
Well, Jim, in that video I was showing later on in the video, it shows that there were other there's these mystery aircrafts that are in the air, and they're not helicopters. So something else was going on that could have, caused the projection. Now, if there was a missile, and I have some images that I don't think has ever been shown in these presentations for 9/11 that are quite compelling and quite shocking. Are you ready for those,
Sure,
Jim?
go ahead.
Okay, let me exit full screen. Now, these were available. Let me make it a little larger so we're going to zoom in on this.
By the way, I did a debate with a fellow by the name of Steve Dack who has suggested that missiles were fired at the buildings to create the cutouts that I'm attributing to the gelatin group. He believes missiles were fired to create the cutouts. Obviously, they weren't highly successful, but we do have the cutouts. However they were done, whether by the gelatin group or by missiles, that maybe that's what you're going to present here. Evidence supporting his hypothesis of missiles having been fired to create the gases.
All right, well, let's take a look at this one. What does that look like?
Yeah, no, I've seen that. Yeah, that's a cruise missile made up to look like a American Airlines plane. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to screen share another one now. And well, for our viewers, this may be new for them. This may be the first time. I did get these from social media, so, just putting that on the record there. You can see the men who are operating the...
Yeah, but notice that's much too small to be the 767 in the videos.
It is, but this is what is it? I mean, let's just notice that their eyes are blacked out so we can't identify who they are. It's not a coincidence. This could have been part of the holographic projection. I don't know, because I don't know how the technology works. But why would they have it decorated to be an American Airlines flight? For what, right? So so anyway, here's another one. Here's another that I think is going to be a little bit more damning and damaging to... Yeah. Okay.
Well, the witnesses gave all sorts of descriptions of what they saw. Some said it was a large plane, some said a small, some said it was a commercial plane, some said it was a military. Oh, that's interesting. 11, 77, 93, 175, Louisa. That's pretty fascinating. Where'd you find this?
On the internet. This was in social media. Came across my my desk and I said, what the heck is this? And yeah, obviously you can see different locations. You can see the towers. You can see, I mean, what is this? I just want to ask the question, what is it?
Well, it's very, very damn interesting. We remember, we already know no plane crashed in Shanksville, and then no plane hit the Pentagon.
Right.
So that takes care of 93 and 77, 11 and 175. Of course, we're both in New York.
But you know, one of the other things that I wanted to screen share for just a moment is I did a search today because Q has talked about this, and you know, we talk about Q on the GoldFish Report, and so here are a few of the entries for 9/11 on the Q page, and they do talk about what family was permitted to leave immediately after 9/11, who authorized the departure. Why is this relevant?
And
Now,
of course, this was the Bin Laden family was actually
Exactly.
flown out after all commercial flights were grounded, but Bush Cheney allowed the Bin Laden family to be flown out. Now, let me say, Osama bin Laden was our man in Afghanistan. He was instrumental in getting the Stinger missiles into the hands of the Mujahideen. They used to shoot down Soviet helicopters and planes that drive them out of Afghanistan. He was Colonel Tim Osman. He was an officer in the CIA, where he was visited in a hospital in Dubai shortly before his death on 15 December 2001 by an official of the agency. His death was reported in local obituaries, and on 26 December, both CNN and Fox News reported that Osama bin Laden had died.
Well, here we have another post talking about 9/11, and he's saying, you know, how is Alaweed and Bush Senior Jr. connected? What occurred post 9/11? What war did we enter into? What was the purpose and disclosures given re justification? Who financed 9/11? Why recently are classified 9/11 pages being released? What just occurred in Saudi Arabia? So, you know, on this page, you can get the answers here and you can look up what they're talking about. 800 billion, what just occurred in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, Louisa, there's a big effort here to divert attention to Saudi Arabia because 15, as I said, 15 of the 19 hijackers were actually from Saudi Arabia. This is to divert attention from Israel, but the hijackers were fake too. In fact, a half a dozen or more turned up alive and well the following day, made contact with the British media.
Right.
And that Griffin makes that the very first point of his magisterial work, the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions.
Yes, and that was in that video that that I can put the link in the description section for folks who want to take a look at it, and they do talk about that in there.
Yeah. So, I mean, if they turned up alive and well, they obviously didn't die. Right. Here's their reporting about Flight 175 still being in the air. In fact, they tracked and found the plane was over Harrisburg, Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania after it had allegedly hit the South Tower. In other words, not only did they find that 93 was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois after it had officially crashed in Shanksville, but that 175 was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania after it had officially hit the South Tower. And now I remind you how I obtained the Federal Aviation Administration records showing the planes used for those flights were not even deregistered or formally taken out of service until 28 September 2005, 4 years later. Now, these were the alleged perpetrators, but notice, they didn't crash a plane in Shanksville. They didn't crash a plane at the Pentagon. They didn't crash a plane into the North Tower. They didn't crash a plane into the South. It was all a fabrication. You know, as I say, a half a dozen or more of these guys turned up alive and well and made contact with the British media the following day. How gullible are the American people to not understand that if these guys were alive the following day, they did not die in suicide crashes on 9/11.
Jim, they're so gullible that this has worked. This hoax has worked. This is the most elaborate 30-year planned false flag ever.
Yeah, it is fairly stunning. Now, here's the point I make. If no planes crashed, then no passengers died and no Islamic hijackers caused them to crash. And if no Islamic hijackers caused them to crash, then there was no warrant or any justification for the war on terror. We
Right.
invaded Afghanistan virtually within a month. We invaded Afghanistan. Now, it would be not until 2003 we would invade Iraq. But what we have done is to undertake these multiple invasions of the Middle East. I'll return to that theme on behalf of Israel. Donald Trump, interestingly, was the first personality in the world to contest the official version of 9/11 on television that very day. After having noted the engineers who built the Twin Towers were now working for him, he declared on New York's Channel 9 that it was impossible that Boeing's going to burst through the steel structures of the towers. He continued by saying that it was also impossible that Boeing's could have caused the towers to collapse. He concluded by affirming there had to be other factors involved, of which we were as yet unaware. He actually used the word bombs, and we now know it was actually, in the case of the Twin Towers, nuclear devices, which we addressed at our last show from Monday, Louisa.
Right.
This is why many of us thought Donald Trump would turn out to be a 9/11 truther and would release information exposing what actually happened on 9/11.
No, he still might. I mean, he did, release some, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. I mean, he doesn't want people to riot. He doesn't want there to be mass, hysteria. I mean, people are going to be so pissed off when they really, take that red pill, Jim, instead of the blue one. Everybody's swallowing that blue pill.
Yeah, nice point. Now, between the hit on the South Tower and the North, between the collapse of the South Tower and the North, really the demolition, because neither building collapsed. It wasn't even physically possible for them to collapse. The constant reiteration of the word makes it almost impossible to describe without using that word, but it's an inaccurate depiction because they were blown apart in every direction from the top down. Actually, what appears to have been a two-part effort with destroying the inner tube from the bottom up and then the outer tube from the top down. They played classic footage of Palestinians rejoicing and created the impression that this was concurrent with what was going on in New York. In fact, the Palestinians were just as slack-jawed and dumbfounded by what was taking place in New York as the rest of the world.
Right.
But this is a sign of the perps who was behind it, because the Israelis blame the Palestinians for everything. They even wanted to blame them for 9/11, even though Palestine, they are so impoverished and have such limited resources. The very idea they could have been responsible is laughable. And it turned out they just happened to have this footage, which was from a much earlier political or religious event where the Palestinians were celebrating, at hand to play on national TV when the attention of the world were focused. Rudy Giuliani, alas, was all too prepared for 9/11. He had to play a role in all of this. He had some 115 dump trucks lined up the following day to haul away the debris. I would say in New York, it would take you a month or more to line up one dump truck. He had 115 the following day to get rid of the evidence. And as I explained in our earlier program, Barry Jennings was inside Building 7, where Rudy Giuliani was not at his command and control's headquarters. This was the day of the mayor election, and I think Rudy was hoping he'd be reelected or kept as mayor for a third term. It didn't play out that way,
Right.
but I believe that was his intent. Meanwhile, the origins of 9/11 were in Israel. It appears to have been the product of the fertile imagination of Bibi Netanyahu, who had a conference on terrorism and published a book, Terrorism: How the West Can Win, in 1987, before the word terrorism was even on the consciousness of the West in general. This appears to have been coincidental with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which took place in 1990-91, and the creation of the Project for a New American Century, which insisted that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was now an opportunity to create a new American empire worldwide that would endure for 100 years. Among their publications, where their members were dual U.S. and Israeli citizens for the most part, among their publications about rebuilding America's defenses, notice They were worried the American people would be slow on the uptake to realize the opportunity that would be availed if the United States were only to move aggressively into the Middle East and exert military and diplomatic pressure outward from that geopolitically sensitive region. So they wrote, further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Right. So that you had all these members of the Bush-Cheney administration talking already on 9/11 as a new Pearl Harbor. The seeds for which had been planted by the Project for a New American Century, most of the members of whom had moved into the Department of Defense as part of the new administration, Louisa.
Well, Jim, let me just comment on there for a second, because if you are a mean, evil world dictator trying to create a new world order and force one world religion and a depopulation agenda, and you know that you already established the pace and the protocol and the way that policy is actually created in Washington, right? It's all very incremental, so you don't notice the changes. And their agenda, is going too slow. Well, what do you have to do? And the way policy changes is through what's called, it's either incremental or through punctuating events. And that's exactly what they're saying, a catalyzing event. But policy can change only through, like major policy change can only happen through some sort of punctuated event. This is in the public policy literature that I was studying in graduate school. And this is exactly how they knew they had to do 9/11 in order to then implement this, not only war on terror, this fake war on terror that would cause us to lose more of our freedoms and infringe on some of our privacy and so forth. But it also gave them that pivot into the Middle East. They wanted to do whatever they wanted to do there, so they never do it for one reason. It's so multi-reasoned. All the gold that was missing in the basement of the World Trade Center, all the trading companies,
cover for the 2.3 trillion, and exactly. As Wesley Clark would reveal, he had returned to the Pentagon after serving as Supreme Commander Allied Forces Europe, meaning he was a commanding general of NATO. And when he initially returned, he encountered a general with whom he was friendly, who explained to him the plan to invade Afghanistan. Well, actually, at that point, they were talking about invading Iraq, and they were both puzzled because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. He said, well, keep me informed. He returned later, months later, and encountered the same general and said, are we still planning to invade Iraq? And the general called him into his office and said, oh, no, sir. He said, it's much worse. We just have a memorandum from the Secretary of Defense that we're going to attack 7 countries in the next 5 years. And Clark said, well, is it classified? And the general said, oh, yes, sir. And Clark said, well, then don't show me because I may want to talk about it later. On October 3rd, 2007, at the Commonwealth Club in California, he explained that the new plan was to take out the governments of 7 countries in the next 5 years, beginning with Iraq and Libya, ending with Syria and Iran. In other words, to take out the modern Arab countries that serve it as a counterbalance, Israel's domination of the entire region, and eventually to confront the Persian nation with Iran. You can see the residue of all of that now. Hillary led a slaughter into Libya, maybe the most humane society ever realized on the face of earth. We have destroyed Iraq. We've tried to destroy Syria. It survived because of the intervention of Russia and Iran at the request of the Syrian government. But Bibi's not done. Mark my words. Now, here are Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, who are key players in the Department of Defense in bringing us 9/11. By the way, let me make this point. Bush and Cheney had to win the election over Al Gore in order to bring us 9/11. The Supreme Court intervention is on black blot on the history of the Supreme Court. They had no role to play here. It was actually stolen from Gore, who legitimately won the election. But Bush and Cheney had to come into the administration in order to take control. This is Philip Zelikow, who was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission before he entered the government. His area of specialization in the academy and higher education was the creation and maintenance of public myths. Louisa, his area of specialization was the creation and maintenance of public myths, MYTHS, and that's what they gave us on 9/11 public myths.
Right.
Alvin Hellerstein, by the way, is a judge for the U.S. District Court who has bottled up lawsuits related to 9/11. He's been involved in these high-profile cases, including against the airlines, ICTS, Pinkerton Security, the World Trade Center, and Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer. He is their safety valve. Ehud Barak and Bibi Netanyahu were no doubt the principals behind the events of 9/11. Here are some of their observations in response. Ehud Barak, hours after 9/11 transpired. The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization, as though he were a part of the USA. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it's a kind of bin Laden organization, notice how he's planting the seed, even though Osama bin Laden was our man in Afghanistan, was instrumental in getting Stinger missiles into the hands of the Mujahideen they used to shoot down Soviet planes and helicopters and drive them out of the country. He was Colonel Tim Osmond in the CIA, where an official of the agency visited in a hospital in Dubai shortly before his death of his medical maladies on 15 December 2001, where there were local obituaries about his burial in an unmarked grave in accordance with Muslim tradition, and where both CNN and Fox News published on 26 December reports of his death. And even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. The same kind of struggle that our forefathers launched against the piracy on the high seas. Notice how he's attempting to presume he's a part of Western culture when in fact he is its antagonist. And hear from Bibi Netanyahu, perhaps, if anything, even more telling. If we get caught, they will just replace us with persons of the same cloth. So it does not matter what you do. America is a golden calf, and we will suck it dry, chop it up, and sell it off piece by piece until there is nothing left but the world's biggest welfare state that we will create and control. Why? Because it is the will of God, and America is big enough to take the hit, so we can do it again and again and again. This is what we do to countries we hate. We destroy them very slowly and make them suffer for refusing to be our slaves. This is Bibi Netanyahu. I repeat, this is what we do to countries that we hate. We destroy them very slowly and make them suffer for refusing to be our slaves. They're talking about you and me and America, the United States. Meanwhile, they were aided and abetted by our own perps, where Dick Cheney appears to have been the executive director of 9/11 from a bunker beneath the White House. Michael Rupert, in his brilliant book, Crossing the Rubicon, from public sources, was able to put together the mosaic that placed Dick Cheney at the center of the event, where George W. Bush was merely a figurehead, too much of a dim bulb to actually entrust with information about what was really going on, lest he reveal it inadvertently or otherwise. Meanwhile, Jack Mullen has published a brilliant new article on my blog, which you can find there at jamesfetzer.org, including a 9/11 truth awareness curve, where the more you spend time studying 9/11, the less you believe in Al-Qaeda or even merely the neocons or the Zionists, but come to recognize a central role of Israel in 9/11. If you want more, if you want something very close to the definitive account of who was responsible and why and how it was done, you want America nuked on 9/11. Compliments of the CIA, the neocons in the DOD, and the Mossad, where they came from the Project for a New American Century into the Bush-Cheney administration, which incidentally is why they had to steal the election from Al Gore in order to bring us 9/11. Completely stunning, but that's the way it is. Go to Moonrock Books and obtain your copy. Don't let yourself be played. And never forget, Israel did 9/11.
Let's just also mention, I have this other photo here. Upon that investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's home, when the police went into his home, they found some very unusual artwork in his home. And this was among the artwork found.
Yeah, George Bush, and look at the destroyed buildings down there as though it were the World Trade Center and a plane, paper plane. That's fascinating. Yeah. That's fascinating. Like George W. Bush was a child, and he was very childlike.
Oh, I think he was, you know, man.
One of the reasons it's clear he wasn't actually fully informed about 9/11 is he went to speak at Booker Washington Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, where I resided for 5 years. And he was talking. They were reading a book about a little girl who had the book upside down. When Andy Card came in to tell him that there'd been a second hit and that America was at war, he doesn't change his expression at all. He doesn't react. He stays there with the kids for several more minutes. Now, what's most interesting is Bush was several times interviewed and said how he watched Flight 11 hit the North Tower. But that footage of Flight 11 hitting the North Tower, the Nadeem footage, wasn't even shown until the following day. Bush saw it on real time while he was in his presidential limousine, meaning the Secret Service had a closed-circuit TV watching that side of the North Tower, which ordinarily would be boring. This would be like watching grass grow, nothing to see. Where Bush actually watched, and he reported on several occasions, he thought when he saw that, man, what a terrible pilot. And he was going to say it a third time on a major network, and they just had to cut it out. They had to delete it because it meant that he knew he'd actually witnessed directly that first hit, which would have been impossible otherwise, so that he was actually given information that he wasn't able to handle as a culprit, as a participant in 9/11.
Right. Let's not forget that, boy, I'll tell you, Jim, we could go on for so long talking about these things. Let's just take a look. I'm screen sharing something that's from the military organizing for operational deception, published by the United States Army. And this is a book, this is talking about the operationalization. I'm sorry, it's a little late tonight now. It's like 9 o'clock. Military deception, because we're actually pre-recording this. Military deception requires close synchronization while controlling the dissemination of information. This has been lost in the process of deconstructing operational staffs. So it goes on. You can pause this and read this and screen share. This was a document. Who knows where when you're an investigative reporter.
This was published in 2010, of course. This is 9 years after 9/11.
Well, I mean, it doesn't mean it's not revised. You know what I mean?
Of course it's revised. Of course it
is. Right, exactly. But I'm just saying that I did come across it. And we also have this video of the children reading out loud, and I would like to, if I can pull that up really quick, because the children are actually.
I've never been quite convinced by the point you're about to make, but go ahead with it nevertheless.
The children are saying plane hit, plane hit. Come on, it's ridiculous. You can't even make this up. I just want to try to find the. Let's see, kids.
But you're right. There's so many aspects of these cases that are so completely absurd. You wouldn't believe they could be real, and yet it turns out they are.
Yeah. Now I don't want to, hold this up. I know this has been a
It's all
pretty
right.
long presentation as it is, but it was quite, stunning to hear what the children were actually saying.
This is
Uh,
Bush and Booker Elementary School in Sarasota.
right. Just I can't seem to find it. Children
The book
reading.
My Pet Goat is upside down in his hands. Really ironic.
Yeah, it's got to be a YouTube video somewhere. Maybe if I just go over to YouTube real quick, I can find it. So,
You could add it on.
yeah, and you know what, Jim? I mean, the whole thing about the dust analysis and what was in there, and that it was, clearly this was a nuclear event, which we haven't even talked about, which we should talk about.
Well, Louisa, we already talked about it. That was
We
part
did
one. This is part two.
Okay, well, there was more details about that. So, children reading on 9/11. All right, should be in here. The children reading. Yeah, here it is. This is a little bit. Let's just see if this is the video.
Where were you on 9/11?
Not showing the video, Louisa. I've not seen the video.
No, I'm not sharing it yet because I'm not ready to share it. I'm sorry, folks. I'm doing this on the fly. So let me just. Oh man, gotta listen to this.
Get ready to read this word the fast way. Get ready. Yes. Sound it out. Get ready. Sound it out. Get ready. What word? Yes. Yes. Boys and girls, sound this word out. Get ready. What word? Steal. Yes, steal. Read these words the fast way. Get ready. Yes, play. Get ready. Must. Yes, must. Let's read these words the fast way.
Do you hear this? Listen to this, please.
Sound it out. Get ready. Yes,
Kite.
get ready to read this word the fast way. Get ready. Yes. Sound it out. Get
Look at him. He's like drooling.
Sound it out. Get ready.
Hits.
What word?
Hits.
Boys and girls, sound this word out. Get ready.
Steal.
What word? Steal. Yes, steal. Read these words the fast way. Get ready. Yes.
Plane. Come on. Must.
How ridiculous can you get, Louisa? You're
satanic.
absolutely right. I had not seen this video before. You've convinced me.
Steal. All right, folks, please. How many, like Q says, how many coincidences do you need before it's mathematically impossible? Folks, we have all been terribly, terribly hoodwinked. We have been in the most grossest violation of trust that our government, previous administrations have, organized and planned and perpetrated such a violation and egregious breach of trust. These people are guilty of treason and sedition, and they all need to be tried in military tribunals and let their fate be dealt with through this. Because this is, folks, if you're not convinced yet, then there's no hope for you. But I think most of our viewers get it. Jim, do you have any other comments you want to leave us with?
Well, just we were massively played on 9/11, and we're living with the consequences to this day. Bush and Cheney were in an unholy alliance with Bibi Netanyahu and Ehud Umart in bringing us 9/11 and all the tragic consequences that have ensued. Trump was voted into office to end those wars in the Middle East, to reallocate the trillions we were expending to benefit Israel in order to turn them to benefit the American people. He was right then, and we can only hope that he will follow through. The firing of John Bolton today was a good sign, because Bolton wanted to extend those wars, and I believe he was fired because Trump would like to end them.
Yeah, and I just want to end on, and I'm not trying to make light of this by any means, folks, but I mean, even this is, a little bit more believable than the official story. Quite honestly, I mean, Godzilla, I'm sure we could find some footage of Godzilla, making an appearance there. But honestly, what the takeaway from this whole thing is that, you can't destroy the American spirit no matter what you do, you might be able to knock off some of us, but in the end of the day, this is what remained. This is what these firemen, you know, it was a very iconic image from that day, and they're still standing. And well, today, who knows, because of the nuclear fallout and all the radiation, if those, you know, firefighters are still with us, I don't know. But you know, there is a lot of compelling information about the nuclear, that it was a nuclear event and so forth. It's so much more to learn, folks. But you know what? Nothing's going to come out unless we demand it. We have to demand truth on 9/11. That's why, Jim, you organized the group that you did. We have architects and engineers for 9/11, and you know, you can't say everybody's a conspiracy.
No, I organize scholars for 9/11 Truth. I regard
Right.
architects and engineers as a limited hangouts. Louisa, they won't even talk about who was responsible and why. They push the nanothermite hypothesis.
Oh, are they?
So I am at odds with architects and engineers. I don't
Okay.
hold them in high esteem.
Okay, all right, for the record. But I'm saying that there's people, okay, there's people out there, obviously, the people who perpetrated this are going to want to put some, you know, narrative out, you know, some disinfo agent to control the narrative. That's what they do. So they control what they want you to think, as long as you never think Israel's involved in anything. So, so Jim, did you have any final comments you wanted to make, or we kind
No,
of?
I've already said.
Case. All right, folks, we're going to put this together. We're going to present this to you. Let's remember the people on 9/11, and let's never let this happen again. Let's hold our public officials accountable and never let them do this to us again. And we need to have some accountability. So, Jim, thanks so much for all of your research and hard work and presenting this with me today. I appreciate it being here. Okay, folks, we'll be back next week. We have another special interview coming up regarding the financial and economics, financial situation, global financial, geopolitics. Later this week, we'll have that available for you as well. And we'll be back next week. Jim and I will be back next week for another POTUS report, folks. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining us. And this concludes this edition of the GoldFish Report.